Hi guys, Jared here, and today I'm going to talk about something interesting. I got a few private messages on YouTube asking me about exactly why the Saturn failed, because people had seen some of the videos that I've been posting lately and they said, wow, these games look pretty sick, so what happened? So that's it. I'm going to talk about why the Saturn failed and what Sega could have done differently to avoid basically shutting down the Saturn project completely. So to begin, we got to go back to what the original plans were. Well, the original plans with the Saturn were to release it around the same time as the original PlayStation in 1995. Both machines were supposed to go for $399.99, which, yes, was expensive, but you got to think that these were 3D powerhouses. And no one at the time knew exactly 100% what Nintendo was going to price their console at. They knew that it was going to be cartridge-based, but still there was quite a few things that were still up in the air with Nintendo. So, what ended up happening? Well, basically, Sony comes in and surprises everyone and says, well, our system's actually not going to cost $399 like the Sega Saturn. It's going to cost $299. So Sega has a moment of panic and goes, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to announce Saturn Day, which was a Saturday in May 1995. And that surprise announcement not only got people together going, what's this all about? But they actually launched the machine 4 months early on that Saturn Day, as they called it. And because they launched without telling anybody, that includes all third parties and major retailers. I don't have a list in front of me of which retailers were included on that one Saturday, but it wasn't many. So put yourself in the position of third parties and of retailers. Would you really want to support a company that just gave you the ultimate shaft? Now, before we continue, you need to understand a few things here. When a console launches, you always work with retailers because retailers need to sell your console and the games that are going to be on your console. And to do that, you need shelf space. So you work with them, you sort of, you butter them up a little bit, and you hope that they will give you as much shelf space as possible. But now you've got a company that just came in and they don't give a damn. I mean, you have history with Sega, and you know that recently Sega's hardware, including the 32X and the Sega CD, haven't been selling all that well, and you guys got the shaft, the retailers, with all this extra inventory. So right away you're already a little bit leery, and now you've got this, where they don't even include you in their plans. Would you really want to give them shelf space? Well, no, not really. I'll give it to Sony instead, and that's exactly what ended up happening. Now, let's look at third parties. Third-party developers and publishers make a lot of money at launch because they don't have to invest quite as heavily into the original launch titles as they do later on. I know it seems sort of like an oxymoron because you would assume that they would have to spend more money to learn on the machine and what have you. And that's true, they do. There's a lot of research and development costs. It's just that the games aren't expected to have the same sort of finesse, the same sort of polish, if you will. And so because of that, these game companies can sell a large amount of money of even somewhat crappy games. And it's not taking advantage of the situation as much as it is they just don't have the technical expertise with these machines as of yet. So imagine, you're working on a bunch of Saturn titles, you're giving them a shot, and then they do something like this. Well, you have no idea how many games were actually canceled, both internally at Sega and from third parties. I mean, they were like, well, if the company's going to shaft us like this, to hell with them, we're going over to the PlayStation. And many titles that were supposed to be cross-platform games would eventually become PlayStation exclusives. And now, let's look internally at why this even happened. Well, it actually predates the Saturn. It goes far back to the Genesis era, where management at Sega was just all over the place. Each individual branch at Sega didn't really respect one another. The Japanese branch was sort of like the head office, if you will. They were working on their own thing. Then there was Sega of America, who thought, it's because of us that the Genesis is so successful here, and we're going to do our own thing. And then in Europe, it was the same deal. Instead, of working together to have everything synchronized so that, there was like a global, worldwide plan for Sega, there was nothing. There were all these region plans. And basically what happened was the creation of the 32X and the Sega CD happened. They were released and they were abysmal failures. The 32X ended up selling around 600,000 units, and it was from 1994 to 1996. The Sega CD did a little better at 1 point something million, and that was from 1992 to 1995. And, think of this. If you're a Sega fan around this time period, you don't know what's going on with management. There wasn't the internet back then. So you're just wondering, you're like, why are all these add-ons coming out, and there's very little support for these add-ons, and then boom, you pick up a magazine and you find out Sega Saturn's announced for 95, and you're scratching your head. You're like, well, what the hell? I've had my Sega CD from 1992. That means it's only going to be 3 years old, and my 32X I just picked up in 94, and now you're saying next year there's a new console. What's going on here? So all of this, basically, when you take it together, this is where everything really started to fall apart for Sega. They really needed to show that they cared about this new system instead, of the surprise launch. And, when you look back now in retrospect, you see that they didn't even have a huge title to launch with. It was supposed to be Virtua Fighter, but because of the surprise launch, it ended up becoming one of the crappiest ports in Sega history. So the bottom line here is, players were already kind of not feeling very comfortable with Sega because of what happened with the 32X and the Sega CD. Retailers and third-party developers were furious at them for the surprise launch, and that's it. That's all there is to it. If the company didn't decide to fix these problems, you knew what was going to happen. And eventually, what we all knew was going to happen, happened. Third parties eventually didn't want to work on the Saturn, which was actually technically more powerful than the PlayStation in certain aspects, but it was a lot more complicated, and developers were like, well, screw them, it's not worth it, we'll just release it as a Sony exclusive. When the PlayStation came out, it started slowly, but it really picked up once all these games started getting released on it and people started to see the potential in the platform. In Japan, things were a lot different because retailers were involved, third parties were involved, but those games, those great Japanese exclusives, never made their way to North America because of all of these individual problems. So the bottom line is this. You've now got a market where publishers and retailers are ticked at you. You're $100 more expensive than your closest competitors, and you don't have a showpiece, that one AAA launch title. So what are you going to do? Before long, Sony just steamrolls the Saturn, and so does the N64. By 1997, the writing was on the wall. Saturn was a disaster and a complete failure. The president of Sega of America basically says Saturn is not the future of our company, which eventually gets back to Japan, so a lot of Japanese developers eventually start getting a little bit nervous because they're like, well, if you guys don't have faith in the platform, then why should we? Eventually the Dreamcast project gets started, which you all know, and that's released in 98 in Japan before hitting North America in 99, where Sega would rally together and have a really strong lineup, but by that time it was already too little too late. So how could this have actually been fixed? Let's say they still launched the Saturn at that price point and with the shoddy port of Virtua Fighter and the surprise launch and what have you. I think the first thing they needed to do was get their management in order. That was the key thing that could have saved the company, but instead, it didn't happen. They should have also grabbed their closest publisher, said we're going to relaunch the Saturn, sort of like a Saturn 2.0 launch, just like what Nintendo recently did with the 3DS. I would have lowered it at $299, maybe changed the hardware a little bit, like the look of it, and really focused either on fighters or shooters or something, anything that really would have got people's attention. And I would have worked extremely close with Konami and Capcom in the United States, well, in all of North America, to really push and say, you know what, we're here and we're taking this serious. I would have apologized. I would have done whatever it took to stick with this platform. And they needed to do that to show gamers that they weren't just going to give up on the platform, which they actually did. And how it all could have been prevented was actually super easy. Just don't launch early. Let the third parties get involved. Let them, take their time with their games. Let the retailers get involved as well, so that shelf space could have been allocated to the Saturn, and they could have even lowered their price at a later point in time. Unfortunately, as you all know, none of these things happen. Sega didn't apologize to anyone. Management didn't get any better. Third parties across North America slowly but surely just gave up on the system, and there was a period of about a year and a half where Sega was just not even really making games for the North American market. It was a complete and utter colossal failure, which could have been avoided with just a few simple changes. And that is why the Sega Saturn failed, and it's a true shame. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I really appreciate all the different comments everyone's been leaving. By all means, let me know if you'd like me to cover any other systems that you think are awesome that just didn't work out for whatever reason. Thank you once again, and have a good one.